You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. With the help of a wide range of guests, we examine how war and peace are experienced in different periods and places, and we discuss the world-building impact which representations of conflict and its aftermath can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice König, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guest today is Erika Weiberg, Assistant Professor of Classical Studies and Theatre Studies at Duke University. Erika has recently published a book called Demanding Witness: Women and the Trauma of Homecoming in Greek Tragedy, which investigates how the trauma of female characters is represented and received in 4 ancient Greek tragedies about homecoming. To quote Erika's own summary of the book, it argues that tragic representations of female non-combatants' trauma after war expose the ripple effects of violence that wars create, even for individuals and communities distant from the fighting. Yet female characters' trauma is also difficult to recognise and address because doing so challenges social hierarchies and ingrained power structures. As a result, these characters' testimonies bring about a conflict of witnessing for other characters and the audience. Erika's research into the structural and chronic violence done to women who've survived war through the marginalisation of their wartime experiences, and into the efforts that some of them go to bear witness or have others bear witness to their trauma, offers important insights into habits of visualising and witnessing war, and into their intersection with wider social structures and hierarchies. So I'm really looking forward to digging into her work today. Erika, thank you very much for making time to talk to me, and welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So, Erika, if we can dive straight in, one of the universal truths that's often stated about ancient Greek tragedy is that it performed an important social function to help communities affected by war to process its impacts. And of course, we know that Greek tragedies continue to be used today, actually, through a wide range of projects like the Theatre of War Project, the Trojan Women Project, to address people's experiences of war in the modern world. We might talk about those modern uses later, but first of all, do you think that it is actually correct to look at Greek tragedy as a trauma processing mechanism, if you will, for the ancient world? And is that how it was conceived or used in antiquity, or have we imposed that idea on Greek tragedy as we have theorized much more about trauma in the modern world?
Yeah, so I think this idea about trauma being processed through the performance of tragedy has entered into the conversation today because of psychoanalysis's use of this concept of catharsis. So Aristotle, an ancient philosopher writing a century after these plays were being performed in Athens, had this idea that tragedy rouses emotions of pity and fear in order to be cleansed. And that word catharsis is much debated by scholars. But it became an important term for people working on trauma in the 20th century from a more medical perspective. And one of the things that I think is important to remember about the performance of these plays in their original context in 5th century Athens is that they're taking place as part of a religious festival to Dionysus. And that festival has kind of political connotations, has political overtones. It has ritual significance. And through that process of being together with people and experiencing plays, yes, I think there is a way we can think about these plays as addressing difficult issues in a community. But I think this medical use of tragedy might be a too simplified or modern way of thinking about its use in the past. And I also think one of the questions that really animated my work was I often heard about these tragedies being performed as a way of healing trauma. And I thought, well, whose trauma are we really talking about? And I wanted to kind of complicate that picture, especially when thinking about all of the different people who could be affected by war in antiquity.
Yes, absolutely. And that prompts another question from me. So, as you've said, particularly in the 20th century, a lot of theorizing has been done around trauma, taking it very much into the medical space. And a lot of the scholarship about trauma, both ancient and modern, and both real and narrated, is focused, as you highlight in your book, primarily on male trauma. At the start of your book, you actually shine a spotlight on what you call the trauma hero narrative, which focuses attention on men's wartime experiences and then their post-conflict journeys. And I wonder if you can just give us a sense of the general patterns in that storytelling and indeed the dominance of that storytelling relative to, as you say, who else suffers trauma, other people's trauma.
Yeah, I'm building here on the work of veterans and literary critics like Royce Granton, who's identifying this trauma hero narrative in modern accounts of war, where you have a soldier, and it's almost always a male soldier, return from war, often a distant war, so not one that is happening where that person lives, and brings back with him these war experiences that continue to haunt him. And the story is a story of this veteran's overcoming of that pain or injury from past experience, which, shatters his connections with himself and his community. And in the end, there's a move toward reintegration with the community. And one of the things that Royce Granton and others have noted about this kind of a narrative is that it focuses attention entirely on an individual's experience of trauma and recovery at the expense of asking important questions about why was the soldier fighting that war in the first place? So these more political kinds of questions. And it also really zeroes in on the male soldier from these like centers of imperial power like the US or the UK, and never talks about the people that he was fighting in the war, and also rarely talks about the ways that experience affects the people around him at home. So I was interested in thinking about whether Greek tragedy has a wider view of who's traumatized by war and why than this kind of modern story of the trauma hero.
Yes, really interesting. And I think we can probably all, as we're listening, think of several Hollywood films that fit into the
Yes,
category that you've just described, where,
yes, I
yes,
think
sometimes the ripple effects on their wider family, on a partner, on a child are a little bit explored. But as you say, it's the male trauma hero's narrative that is absolutely centered, and very little visibility of, as you say, the people they've been fighting with, the civilians who have been displaced in the course of that conflict, and the sort of the wider ripples of that geopolitical situation.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, I think I talk about American Sniper in the book as a well-known example of this story pattern, but I think it's pretty pervasive in popular media about trauma these days, even when it's not about a soldier necessarily. So this kind of simple narrative of trauma and overcoming of trauma. But I do think we see the seeds of it in some ancient narratives as well.
I suppose what you've just said there points to a couple of really important storytelling trends in the sense that we should be aware of. One, as you say, that is focused on particular kinds of perpetrator victim, as it were, which is essentially what the trauma hero narrative revolves around, but also a sort of somewhat reductive understanding of trauma as only pain and only problem and only something that is an injury that needs healing. And we've certainly had guests on the podcast in the past who've talked about post-conflict growth, not
Mhm.
just post-conflict trauma. And so, yes, there are many ways in which I guess the trauma hero narrative is reductive, not just in terms of who it focuses on, but the aspects of that individual's story that it chooses to foreground. So you've been interested in this particularly in terms of gender and in the way in which women's trauma is often a subplot relative to male combat trauma and the survivor's return and so on. And your book argues that it isn't simply the case that women's experiences of wartime trauma are given less visibility or less narrative attention than men's, but also that women's suffering in Greek tragedy is often staged to expose male concerns, right? To help us think more about male agency, more about male inner conflict or male suffering. And I wonder if you can give us a couple of examples of that just to help us see it in action.
Yeah. So actually, I would say that one of the things I was surprised by was how tragedy is quite interested in staging women's pain. And this has been talked about quite a lot by tragedy scholars as kind of a paradox, you might say, of tragedy. Like, why do we get in this highly patriarchal society these plays where female characters have very prominent positions and do speak at quite great length to the pain that they've experienced? And so one of the things that people have said about that is that, well, really, because we have male actors performing these roles for what people see as a largely male audience, although I think women did attend the theater, people say, well, this is really about men getting to experience through this kind of inversion, through embodying female characters, something that they couldn't otherwise openly express. And so we can see female pain as really being about the exploration of different facets of male suffering. I kind of wanted to explore the idea that even though, yes, of course, these are male authors writing female characters and male actors performing them, I do think that these female characters' speeches have a kind of power because they are giving voice to representations of women's experiences that can function as radical critique in a way of some of these hierarchies and of this maybe trauma hero narrative that we've talked about already. But the plays, as often as they allow those voices to be heard, they also foreclose or contest or challenge them. And so I was interested in bringing that dynamic to the forefront. And an example of that I like to go back to is in Aeschylus's Oresteia, where you have, the beginning of this tragic trilogy. The character Clytemnestra ends up killing her husband, and then in the final play of that, she's been killed by her son, and she comes back as a ghost, and she tries to rouse the Furies to pursue her son. And as a ghost, she's still really affected by the pain of what she's experienced in life, and she calls upon the Furies to see her wounds in their hearts. And yet, even as you have that kind of very powerful demand for the Furies and also the audience to see her wounds, in the end of that play, you have the Furies being really tamed by this kind of process of the trial of Orestes in Athens, and they end up being incorporated into the Athenian civic space in a way that's considered safer, perhaps, than this opening scene where you have Clytemnestra's ghost pointing at her wounds and demanding people look at them and understand what she experienced. And so there's always this sense that women's wounds can be quite disruptive or unsettling of some of the hierarchies that may, in the end, be put back in place.
Yes, that's a really interesting example there. As you say, a certain visibility for women's wounds, and Clytemnestra there demanding witness of the Furies of the audience. And this sense also, though, that women's wounds, as you say, are disruptive, are destabilizing, are strong, powerful forces that can unleash terror and horror. And then in the structure of the play, a sense that women's wounds and women's pain is safely contained by male systems of authority. So yeah, that's really fascinating. So thinking more about women's wounds, I wonder if you can just give us a few more examples of where in Greek tragedy do we tend to see women suffering in war, and what kinds of suffering gets focused on?
I really focused on homecoming narratives in my book, but I don't think that those are the only ones where we see war's impact on women. But I was interested in scenarios where women haven't necessarily directly experienced war. Can we maybe complicate some of our notions of trauma and think about how these experiences of women at home, waiting, or as caretakers, we might be able to think about the impact of war on them? And one of the things I was especially interested in was this sense of pervasive sexual violence in the ancient world and how it was such a normalized part of the experience of war, and how the fear of that sexual violence was also a really haunting presence, I think, for a lot of women in the ancient world. I didn't talk about this in my book, but I think tragedy is also really interested in thinking about war's impact on the survivors of cities that have been really sacked and destroyed. And The Trojan Women is, of course, the play that I think most people are familiar with. But it's quite striking, actually, how often the aftermath of war is imagined from a female perspective in tragedy, both from people who directly experience it and from people who are more distant from the fighting.
Yes, that's interesting. On one level, fascinating, possibly even reassuring that Greek tragedy pictures women suffering from both direct and indirect costs of conflict. But as you also point out in your book, one of the things that we see women doing in Greek tragedy a lot is constantly feeling the need to demand witness, to have people pay attention to their suffering. And as you've already said, these women have been written into being and are given dialogue by male authors. But it would just be interesting to know a little bit more about the kinds of language or imagery or rhetorical devices that these women are given to deploy by ancient Greek playwrights to describe their own trauma and to ask people to pay attention to it, and whether they sound, in quotes, hysterical or like victims without agency. What kinds of discourse they are given by these male playwrights to describe and ask for witnesses to their suffering?
Yeah. So one of the things I was exploring in this book is the ways that trauma shows up in language and in rhetorical devices. And I don't think that there's only one way. And I also don't think there's only one kind of trauma, which we've hinted at before. And I think in order to understand this, you kind of have to think about how the plays are imagining the particular wound that these women are experiencing. And so in a play where the woman's experience is much more about what I call ambiguous loss, or the uncertainty of will the husband return, the kind of vulnerable position that that puts the family in. I think there are different kinds of literary markers of that, or rhetorical markers of that, than in a play like the Agamemnon, where it's really about this feeling that what is Clytemnestra's feeling that what is right was violated by her husband's behavior. And so for each of those instances, I explored different kinds of literary or rhetorical markers of it. So for this kind of ambiguous loss, textual markers that will replicate for the audience as well this feeling of like expectations being risen, but then overturned, right? And that's baked into the structure of the plays themselves and how they're imagining these experiences. Even though I think scholarship has really been focused on a trauma hero narrative and male trauma, I think a lot of these plays really are not just representing women as passive recipients of the trauma, but they're really giving voice to a lot of these experiences in in-depth ways if you're looking out for it.
It's really interesting that scholarship has actually been perhaps more narrow in its focus than the original Greek tragedies that scholarship has been looking at. I just want to pick up a little bit more, if I may, on this notion of ambiguous loss or ambiguous trauma. So Clytemnestra, you've mentioned a few times, and she's one character amongst several in Greek tragedy who comes into your third chapter, as also elsewhere in your book, where you really particularly explore the way in which women's suffering in and through war can be chronic and ambiguous, so not as clear cut as men's trauma, and not resolved by simple things like victory or homecoming, sort of caesura as clear cut events. So I wonder if you can give us a couple more examples of this sort of more nebulous kind of trauma in Greek tragedy, and the challenges it poses for the people, particularly the women, who suffer from it.
Yeah. So chapter 3 is about a play, Euripides' Heracles, that is probably less well known to listeners than if they've read any tragedy than Clytemnestra's story is. But it's the story of the hero Heracles homecoming from some of his trials. And at the beginning of the play, he's absent, and we get this extended scene with his wife Megara and her children and his mortal father, and they are in this position where they're also being attacked politically in his absence. So they're sort of doubly vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they don't know when Heracles will return. They're missing kind of this major figure in their household, but they're also politically vulnerable as well. And the play is often described by scholars as being this play that doesn't go anywhere in the first half. And while some people have said that, kind of critiqued it for that reason, I'm interested in how it actually replicates this feeling of ambiguous loss, where the family of Heracles doesn't know whether he's alive or dead. And they're in this kind of ambiguous place around mourning him, where they can't simply close the loop of mourning him through a funeral or other kind of rites. And so they're constantly missing him. The children are described as constantly asking their mother about where's their father, asking for stories about him. He's very much present in their mind, but he's not there. And so they're kind of stuck in the first part of the play. And I think that gets at this experience of ambiguous loss that we also see in the epic poem, the Odyssey, for example, with the characters in Ithaca, right, also being in this position of uncertainty about Odysseus's survival, and the kind of chronic and long-term trauma that can create for a family that's not able to move on because of that uncertainty.
Yes, and what you were talking about there really recalls a phenomenon that another guest on the podcast has talked about in the past in relation specifically to World War I and World War II, the concept of temporal dislocation, the way in which conflict involves people who are living within its orbit, whether directly or indirectly affected, in a kind of limbo of time and a limbo of not knowing, and this combination of presence and absence. And it's something that
Yes.
we also see contemporary communities wrestling with all the time. And we've got a podcast coming up about the new kinds of publishing for children's literature in Ukraine. And one of the themes which some of that new children's literature is addressing is this question of where is daddy and is he coming home anytime soon? And so it's a universal experience of conflict, and it's fascinating to see it being explored in, as you say, in a play where analysts have sometimes faulted the plotting of the play's first
Right.
half because
Yes.
it doesn't go anywhere. And as you say, that might actually be just this embedded experience. So thinking about, again, these ripple effects of a male hero's actions and trauma on the wider set of family members, particularly women involved, I was really interested in your discussion of Aeschylus's play Agamemnon, where we see the Greek war leader Agamemnon coming home victorious from the Trojan War, and he brings with him Cassandra, the daughter of Troy's king Priam, who's been killed by the Greeks. And Cassandra, of course, is the prophetess who's doomed never to be believed. She's now a war prize, as it were, in quotes, for the Greek king. And of course, his wife Clytemnestra is enraged both at that and at Agamemnon's sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia. In the myth, she kills her husband and Cassandra. And she's often been analysed as an over-vengeful woman. But you explore her actions in the play as this ripple effect of perpetrator trauma, the result of a kind of moral injury that flows out from Agamemnon's wartime deeds. So I think a lot of us are familiar with the concept of moral injury that's carried by a soldier, but I was really fascinated to see you teasing that out into Agamemnon's wife. And I wonder if you can just explain your arguments here a little bit more and help us see how Clytemnestra's trauma both relates to and is distinct from Agamemnon's trauma and moral injury and his perpetrator trauma, as you put it.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge that, this idea of perpetrator trauma is a kind of controversial one, part because people have rightly called attention to the maybe issue of collapsing categories of perpetration and victimhood. And I think there's a lot of really interesting work being done on thinking beyond those binaries. But I was interested in, this is a play with perhaps the most notorious female heroine in Greek tragedy, maybe with the exception of Medea, who commits this really shocking act of killing her husband. And then not just that, but emerging on stage and being quite triumphant about it. And I noticed in reading the play that a lot of the things that scholars had been noticing in this conversation about moral injury with soldiers, about how perpetrating violence in war can have these particular kind of psychic effects that are not exactly the same actually as other experiences of trauma that involve kind of a violation of what's right. And so this kind of demoralization that sometimes happens about thinking about how the world is kind of beyond repair in a way. And as I was reading that scholarship, I thought, well, Clytemnestra talks about things in a way that is quite similar to, I think, how some of these scholars are imagining the effects of moral injury. And so I wanted to explore that idea with her character. And recently, a book came out by the literary critic Joshua Peterson. It's called Sin Sick. And it's about how all of the ways that experiences of moral injury might show up in language and rhetoric and performance as hyperbole, as a kind of exaggeration of rhetoric, or this feeling of too much. It's exactly those things that scholars have used for a long time to talk about Clytemnestra's rhetoric, that it exhibits this kind of doubleness, or it contains within it too much. It's excessive. So in particular, the injury that I was playing with this character was an injury of omission. So moral injury can be about commission of a crime, or it can also be about omission, not intervening when you know that something wrong has been committed. And so the injury that I was exploring there was the sacrifice of Iphigenia, and the way that she's imagining as a crime of omission there can continue to have these ripple effects after war, and how she also imagines the excesses of the Greek army and the sacking of Troy as having these kind of ripple effects. So that was some of the stuff I was interested in that chapter.
Yeah, so Clytemnestra regretting, feeling conflicted over the fact that she didn't intervene enough when her husband sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia as one of his war deeds. a deed that he absolutely committed and took ownership of, and in a patriarchal society, of course, had responsibility for. So that's a really fascinating way of not only looking afresh at Clytemnestra, but looking back at the scholarly responses to Clytemnestra, and I suppose the kind of moralizing and the, negative judgments on Clytemnestra for being a woman who's too vengeful, who's too exultant in the way in which she murders her husband and his war bride, as it were. Really interesting to think about these sort of parallel or attached kinds of trauma to the trauma of a homecoming hero. In another chapter of your book, you focus on the post-war story of Helen and Menelaus through Euripides' play Helen. And this helps us think about another kind of female trauma that, again, proves harder to articulate or is less easily visible than male trauma. And that's the way in which women sometimes can't claim their experiences as their own, or end up being somehow in the storytelling separated from the trauma in stories that get told about them. So I wonder if you can explain that in relation to Helen and Menelaus's story. If you can sketch a quick summary of Euripides' play, Helen, and then just tell us how you've been analysing the way in which Helen and Menelaus's respective traumatic experiences are handled very differently in that play.
Yeah, this is a wild play. If people aren't familiar with it, I encourage you to read it or try to see it, because this is a play that upends expectations you may have about what happened at Troy. At the beginning of the play, Helen, who is the woman that most people in antiquity and thereafter blame for the Trojan War, for going with Paris to Troy, and therefore launching the 1,000 ships that follow her there by the Greeks. Euripides explores in this play the idea of like, well, what if Helen actually didn't go to Troy? What if she was taken instead to Egypt, where she was kept safe by the king of Egypt during the whole Trojan War? And then even though in her place, a phantom went to Troy, and so the Greek army went to Troy, the whole war happened, but Helen wasn't actually there. It was a phantom Helen the whole time. So the gods sort of engineer this kind of supernatural thing. And the play actually takes place in Egypt, where Menelaus washes up after a shipwreck and finds that, in fact, Helen has been in Egypt this whole time. It's a very different kind of way of imagining the Trojan War story and its aftermath. Helen in the play, I was playing with this idea that is often brought up in modern discussions, the traumatic event as being an unclaimed experience, one that perhaps isn't well understood when it first occurs. And so then the person returns to it after the fact, and it's repeatedly after the fact trying to make sense of it. In that sense, it's an unclaimed experience. So the beginning of the play has this interesting scene between Helen and Teucer, a Trojan War veteran, where Teucer comes, also washes up in Egypt and tells Helen what happened in the Trojan War. And she's in this experience as listener of his story, of being presented with a story about herself that she totally doesn't recognize, right? And she asks questions about it. Did Menelaus drag Helen away by her hair, right? And so she wasn't there, but she was there. She's alienated from that experience, but many people who were there can attest to her being there. So even though the play explores this in kind of a supernatural way, I think it's getting at something recognizable about the experience of trauma today.
Yes, and you talk about the play as a sort of a metaphor, both for trauma recovery, but also for the communalization of the trauma narrative, the way in which injuries that happen to perhaps a particularly notable character, Helen in this case, the stories take on a life of their own and take the experience of trauma away from the character and the character's own experiences. And there's this big disjunction, which of course is traumatizing in itself. And I think we can think of lots and lots of modern examples where the official or the dominant narrative about, let's say, what happened to comfort women during the Second World War is very unclaimed by the women themselves. And there's then a huge effort in later years by individual women and by collectives of women to reclaim the story for themselves as they understood it, as they wanted it told. So so it's really interesting to see that being explored in, as you say, what on the surface seems like quite a mad play that has fun with the Trojan War story.
This play is also remarkable in how it stages Helen as really the driving protagonist of the play, as the one who at first is alienated from her own story, but really over the course of the play gains control of the story. And I think it is also exploring kind of some of the problems of memory culture in that way, where, in the course of taking back control of the story, she ends up reinforcing some of the more simplistic ideas about war, that the earlier experience that she had with the way that stories can proliferate and cause harm, especially women and people from marginalized groups. She kind of ends up reinforcing that herself by casting the Greeks as this kind of victorious force against barbarians, whether those barbarians are Trojans or Egyptians. And so even when she herself is maybe gaining more control of the story, you still see some of the harmful ways that simple stories or narratives about war can be perpetuated after the fact.
So it's almost as if Helen is learning as she goes about the kinds of war storytelling that gains traction, the
Yeah.
simplified storytelling, the sort of more black and white, those are the enemies, these are the goodies, the reductive storytelling. And even as she's trying to break down that for her own story, she's, as you
Yes.
say, understanding the power of it and the effectiveness of it, to tell stories that are
Right.
going to kind of gain traction, that she can pass on. That's
And
really
that she can
fascinating.
use for her own purposes to escape, from this situation in Egypt.
Yeah, so we've been hearing Helen's voice in that play and Clytemnestra's voice as well. She asks people to bear witness to her wounds and so on. So thinking about how female characters articulate their own suffering and narrate their own stories somewhat. But one of the other things that you discuss in your book is the role that internal audiences get to play in Greek tragedy in terms of bearing witness. And I wonder if you could give us a couple of examples of that, just to help us picture how it sometimes works and how that helps to amplify or shape the women's own articulation of their suffering.
Yeah, I think tragedy is a really interesting genre for thinking about witnessing, because it has, an external audience, the audience who comes to view the plays, but it also stages an internal audience. And this is often the chorus, this group of people who are kind of peripherally related to the protagonists of the play, but that are almost always on stage, and they're responding to the events that they see. And people have for a long time thought about them as kind of an internal audience that the external audience can see through. They see through the lens of the chorus in a way. So their staged reactions give a cue to the external audience. But there's also other characters who are positioned as internal audiences sometimes to the protagonist's expressions of pain and suffering. And so I looked at both of those groups, these two kinds of internal audiences, the chorus and also other characters that function in this way as recipients of stories of trauma. And one of the things that I talk about is how often tragedy stages these witnesses of trauma as learning too late from the stories that are told to them, in a way that they can provide the supportive witnessing that the speaker of that story needs. And the case study that I think is most powerful for this is Sophocles' play Women of Trachis, which is also not a very often read play these days. Another Heracles story, a different wife though. The wife's name is Deianira, and she's the wife that ends up accidentally killing her husband, Heracles. And so this is the end of Heracles' life. But in the course of this play, she tells stories about her past multiple times to different internal audiences who don't quite understand what she's trying to tell them in the moment. And that lack of understanding and that lack of being able to bear witness to what she's experiencing, I think, is really the thing that ends up propelling the tragedy of this story, this decision that she makes to send a love charm that ends up killing her husband. And so we see the internal audiences, the internal witnesses being really key to the failures that are portrayed in the play about how to respond to trauma, to women's trauma. And I think something that the play asks its external audience to reflect on those failures.
That's really fascinating. I think in your chapter where you're writing about this, about Sophocles' play Women of Trachis, you talk about this as a sort of insidious trauma, the additional layers of trauma that can result through these failures of witnessing and failures of understanding. And it's really fascinating to hear you thinking about the play, perhaps thematizing this, that failures of witnessing then themselves propel further tragedy, propel further trauma, and whether that's actually one of the lessons that we as an external audience are meant to be taking from the play. You've brought in the issue of wider audiences, the external audience as well as the internal audience. And of course, many of these plays were written for wider audiences who'd been living through wars themselves. So to what extent are the plays implicitly, explicitly inviting their audiences to bear witness to the real world suffering of contemporary women through their staging of the trauma of fictional characters?
That's a really good question. I don't think teach is the right word, but the plays are trying to work through some of these issues of witnessing, how to witness, how not to witness, I guess you could say, in these plays that imagine the failures of witnesses. I mean, I think it's significant that women's trauma is usually met with a kind of failure to witness it in various ways. I don't know if I can say that for its ancient audience that that would be like a cautionary tale. I don't think that I'm really willing to go that far, but I do think it's notable that a lot of the tragedies that I've looked at involve women's experiences demanding witness but not really receiving it, and the failure of that resulting in catastrophe. I do think there's some historical stuff that we could bring in to think about that. Like, I explore a little bit with some plays that can be better dated, like Euripides' Helen, after this huge military disaster that in Sicily that the Athenians experienced. And one of the things that Thucydides also talks about in the aftermath of the Sicilian disaster in Athens is that the Athenians found it quite difficult to accept the stories that they were hearing brought back to them, even from people who had experienced it themselves in Sicily. They couldn't comprehend the kind of totality of that disaster. And so I do think it's something that they were thinking about. I don't know if in particular about women's experiences, perhaps, but definitely as like a larger cultural idea that stories about really disastrous things are quite difficult for audiences to come to terms with.
Really fascinating. And as you say, it may be a step too far to read into individual plays or into patterns across the Greek tragedies that survive, a sort of self-conscious awareness that is encouraging contemporary external audiences to wake up, I suppose, and witness women differently. In fact, one might argue that the opposite is equally possible, right? That if you keep staging women who fail to be heard and who sound mildly hysterical and who are witnesses who then go on to do further problematic things as a result of not being heard, for instance, then you're kind of normalizing that trend. So we could
Right.
argue it in both ways. But as you say, it is really interesting to think about this in terms of contemporary events like the disastrous Sicilian expedition, where Athens lost a huge number of forces, but also confidence and a sort of sense of identity as sort of a military power in their failed attempt to expand their influence in the Western Mediterranean. We can think about the ways in which these tragedies are inviting us to explore what it's like to witness war, what it's like to witness war stories, how hard that can be, and how difficult it actually can be to handle other people's trauma and handle our own trauma. So,
Yeah.
as well as potentially addressing contemporary issues, Greek tragedy has also long been thought of as addressing, in quotes, universal truths that remain universally relevant to today. And as I mentioned earlier, it does, we do see Greek tragedies being deployed in all sorts of modern contexts, sometimes specifically as a trauma intervention. So the Theatre of War project uses readings of Sophocles' Ajax and Philoctetes, for instance, to work with veterans of recent conflicts as they explore their own experiences. And the Trojan Women project uses Euripides' play, The Troades, the Trojan Women, to work with women who've been displaced and harmed in conflict around the world, to explore what they've been through in dialogue with ancient characters by re-performing plays that speak to their lived experiences. You end your book with a warning note, though, that urges us not to take a universalizing approach to trauma and not to leap to simple parallels in our analysis of trauma in ancient Greek tragedy. And so I was wondering what you think are the risks of bringing Greek tragedy and modern trauma studies into dialogue, but also what are the opportunities, particularly for understanding how women's trauma is seen or not seen today?
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's kind of seeming like I'm wanting to have my cake and eat it too in making this case, but I think there's often a binary that's created between like universalist and then historicizing. approaches that I think could be broken down a little bit, because it's my view that we're always viewing the past through the lens of the present. And so I wanted to acknowledge ways that, we are bringing a kind of cultural interest in trauma to these ancient plays, and that I think that cultural interest in trauma can really expose things about the plays that haven't been noticed before, or that have been explained differently before. And so in that sense, maybe that's the universalizing, right? That I'm taking there may be an assumption behind that by using these modern categories, I'm saying they're also existing in the past. But what I think is really important is to historicize those at the same time, because I think trauma, there's no doubt that people experienced terrible things in the past. Did they think about it in exactly the same ways that we do today? No, I don't think they did. And so being able to think about how different cultures in different times and places are constructing an idea of trauma, which might look quite different from how we are thinking about it today. And we can equally learn from that, learn from the differences between the ways that this idea is articulated. I think the thing that the limitations of a universalizing approach have to do with reifying a very particular human experience and making it seem as if it's universal. So that's the danger, I think, of creating a very narrow view of trauma and saying that that's the view that is universal. This experience that perhaps male soldiers in the US have experienced, that we can take that and assume that that is the universal experience. What I've tried to show in the book is that that's too narrow and simple of a way of viewing it, and that I also think that making these comparisons between antiquity, especially ancient Greece, and modern experiences can tend to elevate Greek heroes, which has been part of this whole Western civilization narrative that's been co-opted as part of a Western exceptionalism narrative, and make it seem as if that's the paradigmatic experience of trauma, and that's what we relate to American soldiers' experiences. And I've also been reading recently and really persuaded by some of the arguments of Nadia Abu al-Hajj, who's an anthropologist who's thought a bit about how this kind of narrative, the trauma hero narrative, this kind of universalizing approach, really focuses attention on this particular hero and calls for us as a public to care for that individual, but really not about the individual at all, but care for American militarism. Yeah. And so it becomes not about challenging some of these narratives about war, but about perpetuating them. So I think that those are some of the things that I wanted to push back against in what I see as some attempts to draw too easy comparisons between ancient Greek heroes and modern American veterans in particular, or modern British veterans, or even refugees from different parts of the world. I always think it's important to think about who's really the audience for this and what kinds of work is it doing culturally for that audience.
So that's not having your cake and eating it. That's having a very nuanced position on both the opportunities and the risks inherent in using Greek tragedy as a lens to think about modernity, and also looking at Greek tragedy through the lens of modernity. And, what you've just said there about the way in which these hierarchies of trauma become claims to or encouragements towards certain practices of care, which are themselves part of the everyday militarisms that are embedded in our society, is an incredibly important one. And I think it really goes to the heart of a lot of what you talk about in your book, and goes to the heart of the trauma hero narrative as well, this sort of the very militarizing dimension of that. But yes, you're also really importantly drawing attention to culturally specific constructions and understandings of trauma. And I guess if these Greek tragedies can teach us anything, one of the things that they do teach us is how to read culturally different, culturally very alien sometimes, ways of witnessing, ways of constructing, ways of understanding war and its aftermath, without feeling the need to relate them, to make parallels, to identify commonalities, but actually more to enable us then to look very critically at our own culturally specific habits of understanding conflict, its aftermath, trauma, and, as you say, whose trauma and how it's being perceived by different audiences, and how the narratives of trauma and war's aftermath land with different audiences. So that's, I think, a really interesting note to end on, the ways in which these Greek tragedies get us reading narratives of trauma more critically and narratives of war and its aftermath more critically, so that we might be more critical consumers of them in our own culture, as much as understanding some of the dynamics of these ancient texts more ourselves. Erika, thank you very much for a really fascinating conversation. It's been a joy to read your book. I mean, joy is probably the wrong word. Your book has really got me thinking in new ways about women's trauma, about seeing women's trauma, about witnessing trauma more generally. It's been great to tease that out a bit more with you in conversation today.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight.
And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We do have more episodes coming up as we continue to explore different visualizations of war and peace in different contexts. So please keep tuning in. And if you'd like to support our project, you can share our podcast with others in your networks. You can also join the conversation further by following us on social media. Just search for Visualizing War or Visualizing Peace, or get in touch with us directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafia Gertin. Thank you for listening.